If you publish a book today, there is a 15% chance that it will sell fewer than 12 copy tires.
Yeah, 12.
Total.
12. I mean, that's not a hobby, you know? That is an industry that is actively in crisis.
It really is.
So the question we're starting with is, are we living in this like golden age of storytelling where anyone with an internet connection can find an audience? Or is the internet slowly and systematically ruining how we read, how we write, and how we consume?
Right.
Welcome to the deep dive. We are so thrilled you're here with us.
Yeah, it's a massive structural question, right?
Yeah.
And the answer is incredibly layered.
Very layered.
We have this really fascinating stack of sources to go through today. I mean, we're looking at deep analytical essays, industry research, and a lot of critical commentary exploring this rapidly changing landscape of the publishing world.
Which is changing so fast.
So fast. And we're going to examine the psychology of spoilers, the cultural backlash against platforms like Book Talk, and, ultimately the deep emotional resonance of speculative literature.
Right. So the mission for our deep dive today is to really unpack exactly how the modern internet era is fundamentally rewiring the DNA. We're going to look at how stories are sold, who actually gets the privilege to tell them, how we as readers consume them, and why, despite all these radical and honestly sometimes exhausting digital changes, we still desperately need these stories to process our own real-world grief.
We really do.
Okay, let's unpack this, because when we talk about storytelling, we usually start with the magic, right?
Sure, the art.
Yeah, the art. But I want to pivot right out of the gate and look at the people actually writing the books. How has the internet completely changed the fundamental job description of being an author?
Well, it has rewritten the job description from top to bottom, completely.
Wow.
To really understand the sheer scale of this shift, we have to look at the stark economic reality of the modern publishing business right now.
Okay, lay it on me.
So the traditional publishing landscape is shifting dramatically. Based on recent industry analysis, looking at the top 10 biggest U.S. publishers, the numbers are just sobering.
Right.
66% of all books published by these major houses sell fewer than 1,000 copies in their first year.
Wait, fewer than 1,000?
Yep.
Across the entire first year of... And that's with the backing of a major publisher.
Yes, a major traditional publishing house. And, it gets much more intense, which brings us to the statistic you opened with.
The 12 copies won.
Right. 15% of those traditionally published books sell under 12 copies in their first year.
12 copies? I mean, that's just your immediate family and maybe like a couple of very supportive friends.
Exactly. It's a brutal reality. But then, on the flip side, the top 1% of books sell over 50,000 copies in their first year.
Oh, wow. So it's incredibly top-heavy.
Incredibly. So what happens structurally is that publishers naturally rely on that top 1% just to keep the lights on.
Right. They're carrying the whole company.
They are. They make the vast majority of their income from those established household names.
The Stephen Kings, the James Pattersons.
Exactly. So because of this, publishers have managed to stay afloat in this hypersaturated marketplace by shifting more and more of the marketing responsibility directly onto the authors themselves.
Ah, okay.
It's a way to cut costs and prop up the middle tier of sale, which means we really have to define a term here that the industry uses constantly, the mid-list author.
Right. I always hear that term tossed around in publishing circles, but it feels a bit, nebulous. What exactly is a mid-list author?
Well, a mid-list author is essentially the working class of the publishing industry.
Okay.
They aren't the breakout superstars making millions of dollars, and they aren't the debut authors who just disappear after one flop.
So they're the steady worker.
Exactly. They're reliable professionals. They write solid books. They build a dedicated but modest readership, and they keep the gears of the publishing houses turning.
Makes sense.
Historically, a publisher would nurture a mid-list author over 5 or 6 books, slowly helping them build an audience over time.
Like an investment.
Exactly. But today, the publisher expects the author to bring the audience with them.
Oh, wow. So the publisher basically says, look, we will print the book, we will get it into the distribution channels, but making people actually buy the thing, that is entirely on you now.
That is exactly it. And we actually see this formalized in the modern book proposal.
Really? How so?
Well, if you are an experienced author pitching a nonfiction book or even a highly anticipated fiction project today, your proposal likely requires an extensive section strictly dedicated to your marketing platform.
When you say extensive, like how long are we talking?
Often 10 to 25 pages long.
Well, it's just on marketing.
Just on marketing. You have to detail exactly what you, the author, will do to publicize the book.
That's wild. You have to be a PR expert on top of being a writer.
Right. This means providing demographic breakdowns of your newsletter subscribers, engagement metrics on your social media, conversion rates from your previous online campaigns.
Wow.
The days of just handing over a brilliant manuscript and letting the publisher do the rest are largely over.
It sounds like it's basically requiring a venture capital business pitch where the author's personality is the primary product being sold.
Yes. And what's fascinating here is how this completely shatters the romanticized myth of the quiet, undiscovered genius.
Well, the tortured artist in the attic.
Exactly. We have this deeply ingrained cultural love for the idea of the reclusive writer. We picture Emily Dickinson in her room or J.D. Salinger hiding from the world.
Right. Purely valued for the brilliance of their words and nothing.
We want to believe that true talent will magically find its audience through sheer merit alone, right? Without having to resort to gross marketing tactics.
Yeah, we want the art to be pure. The minute commerce and self-promotion enter the chat, it feels a little unseemly.
It feels sullied. And the sources point out that this resistance isn't actually new at all. It's a historical pattern.
Oh, really?
Give me an example. Look at the ongoing, albeit fringe, debate over the authorship of Shakespeare's works.
Oh, the whole did Shakespeare really write Shakespeare thing.
Right. You have people proposing alternate candidates like Francis Bacon or Christopher Marlowe or the 17th Earl of Oxford.
Right, right.
And the sources offer a really compelling analysis of why people cling to these alternate theories.
Because it's a huge conspiracy theory, essentially.
It is. Historically, many people hated the idea that Shakespeare might have been an everyday middle-class guy from Stratford-upon-Avon.
Because he was just a regular dude.
Exactly. Because it ruined the narrative that great art requires high-born education and worldly travel. But conversely, others hated the idea that he might have been a highly privileged aristocrat.
Right, because then it ruins the whole everyday natural genius narrative.
Exactly. The resistance stems from a desire for the origin story of the art to perfectly match our idealized version of how the world should work.
That is so interesting.
So the idea that someone might have had an unfair advantage, whether it is aristocratic wealth in the 16th century or a massive TikTok following in the 21st century, it ruins the purity of the idea that anyone can make it based solely on the text.
Okay, I hear that. But let me push back a little on the idea that social media marketing is some brand new modern evil destroying the purity of literature.
Go for it.
Hasn't this always just been networking? I mean, let's take J.R.R. Tolkien, right?
Okay, sure.
He didn't just crawl out of a hole in the ground with finished copy of The Hobbit. He was at Oxford. He worked on the Oxford English Dictionary. He was embedded in one of the most prestigious academic networks in the entire world. He was part of the Inklings with C.S. Lewis.
Right, a very elite group.
So isn't having a TikTok following of 100,000 people just the modern digital version of an Oxford connection? It's just a different type of network giving you an audience.
That is a really highly functional analogy.
Yeah.
Networking and connections have absolutely always provided a leg up. There's no denying that.
Right. So why are we so mad about?
Well, the critical difference the sources identify now is the visibility of the effort and the specific skill set required.
Okay, explain that.
Tolkien's network was built through academic rigor and physical proximity, right? He was physically present in those spaces.
Yeah.
The modern digital network requires a constant, highly visible performance of personality.
Oh, it's a performance. Yeah.
It requires content creation. You have to be filming, editing, engaging with comments, trend chasing.
Which is exhausting.
And it's an entirely separate skill from the act of writing a novel. And this leads to a massive, well-documented mental health toll.
Especially for those mid-list authors we discussed earlier.
Precisely. Because they got into this business to build imaginary worlds and write prose. Right, not to be minor internet celebrities.
They just want to write their book.
Yeah, they're often inherently introverted people. Now, they are essentially being forced to become digital personalities, constantly feeding the algorithmic beast.
And the algorithm is hungry.
It demands daily or even multiple daily posts just to maintain relevance. And some authors are actually choosing to leave social media entirely now.
Really? Just walking away?
Yes. Publicly stating that the degradation of their mental health and the destruction of their creative focus just isn't worth the incremental bump in book sales.
Wow.
It is an exhausting pivot for an entire industry.
Which means we all need to take a step back and ask ourselves, and honestly, I'm asking you listening right now, have you ever bought a book just because you like the author's personality online, even before reading a single page of their work?
It's a great question.
Because I know I have. I've watched a funny video of an author explaining their writing process while their cat walks across the keyboard, and suddenly I'm ordering their space opera.
Right, you're buying into them as a person.
Exact. Our buying habits are the engine driving this pressure on the authors.
We are absolutely incentivizing the behavior with our wallets.
Yeah.
And if this intense, digitally driven environment is fundamentally altering how authors behave, it inevitably alters the platforms where this behavior takes place.
The environment shapes the ecosystem.
Exact. The mechanisms of the platforms themselves begin to dictate the culture of reading.
Which brings us perfectly to the biggest force in publishing today, which is book talk.
Oh, yes.
Book talk.
For anyone somehow unaware, this is the subculture of TikTok dedicated entirely to book. And it is massive. It is capable of reviving decade-old backlist titles and sending them to the top of the bestseller list.
The market power is undeniable.
But it is also highly, highly criticized. The sources outline several major critiques against this culture.
Right, there's a lot of pushback. People say it prioritizes aesthetics over subs, that it promotes sphere overconsumption with these massive book hauls, that it's actively shortening our attention spans, and that it pushes formulaic.
So let's examine the foundational architecture of these critics because it's fascinating. Let's start with the attention span argument.
Okay, the idea that TikTok is ruining our brains.
Right. It's a very common refrain to blame TikTok's short-form video format for ruining our collective ability to focus on long-form literature.
Yeah, that we can't read a 500-page book because we're used to 15-second videos.
Exactly. However, the sources introduce a vital piece of historical context to show this isn't actually a new phenomenon at all.
Oh, really?
They reference Herbert A. Simon. He was a Nobel Prize-winning economist and cognitive psychologist.
Okay.
He actually coined the term attention economy way back in the late 1960s.
Wait, the late 60s? Long before the internet was even a concept for the public.
Long before. He gave a landmark speech in 1971 where he articulated a concept that is absolutely crucial to understanding our current digital landscape.
What did he?
He stated, and I quote, "In an information-rich world, the wealth of information means a dearth of something else, a scarcity of whatever it is that information consumes."
Okay, so it has to eat something.
Right. And he went on, what information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. Hence, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention.
Wow. A wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. That is chillingly accurate for a quote from 1971.
Isn't it?
I mean, he wasn't talking about smartphones. He was looking at the rise of cable television, global news network, the proliferation of mass media print.
He was observing the sheer volume of data beginning to outpace human cognitive capacity.
We just physically can't take it all in.
Exactly. He argued that a society flooded with information must design systems to allocate attention efficiently. Fast forward to today, and platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube are not just passive distributors of information.
No, they're highly aggressive.
They are hyper-optimized engines designed by behavioral psychologists to extract that scarce commodity, our attention.
Right, because social media companies literally monetize the time your eyes remain on the screen.
Precisely. So the cultural anxiety over short videos isn't just a simple complaint about a new medium. It is a deep-seated recognition that our limited cognitive resources are being systematically strip-mined by algorithms.
Strip-mined. That's exactly what it feels like. And when you combine that algorithmic strip mining with consumer capitalism, you get the phenomenon of the book haul.
Yes. The haul videos.
Right. For those who haven't seen one, this is a video format where a creator shows off a massive stack of brand new, unread books they just purchased.
We're talking sometimes 20 or 30 hardcovers at once.
Which is so much money. And the criticism here is that the internet has turned the act of buying books into a completely separate hobby from the act.
And it is a valid critique when you examine the underlying psychological mechanisms and the physical consequence.
Break that down for me. Psychologically, what's happening?
Psychologically, the act of purchasing triggers a dopamine release in the brain's reward center.
Right, the rush of getting something new.
We colloquially call it retail therapy, but the sources dive deeper. Research connects this specific dopamine loop to a psychological need for agency control.
Oh, that makes...
Right, because in a modern world where so many massive overarching structures feel entirely out of our hands, think about global economics, political instability, climate change. The simple linear act of selecting an item, executing a transaction, and having that physical object arrive at your door provides a microdose of order.
It's a closed, successful loop of intention and result. It feels good to click buy. It feels like an accomplishment. You have successfully curated a piece of your identity, even if the book just goes onto a shelf to look pretty and you never...
The problem is that the physical consequences of that dopamine loop are staggering.
You mean the actual waste?
Yes. The sources point to a 2009 environmental Environmental Protection Agency report on municipal solid waste in the United States.
What did they find?
In that year alone, the EPA estimated there were 640,000 tons of book waste generated.
640,000 ton books.
Yes, and that data point is from 2009. That is well before the current hyper-accelerated trend of massive, aesthetically driven online book hauls.
Oh my gosh. So it has to be so much worse now.
Undoubtedly. When the primary interaction with a book becomes the act of buying it to display in a 10-second video rather than actually reading it, the environmental footprint becomes deeply problematic.
I am completely aligned with the concerns over overconsumption and the result that is a tangible, measurable problem.
Absolutely.
But I have to offer some pushback here on the anger over aesthetics.
Okay, well, let's hear it.
Because people get incredibly hostile online about readers who color coordinate their bookshelves or who use specific colored sticky notes to tab their favorite pages so they perfectly match the dust jacket.
Right, the aesthetic reader backlash.
Yes.
Yeah.
Critics call it performative, or they claim it isn't real reading. But haven't humans always judged books by their covers?
This is a fair point.
I mean, if you look at fantasy and sci-fi books from the 80s and 90s, they had a very specific, painted, heavily stylized aesthetic. Publishers have poured millions of dollars into cover design for a century, specifically to catch your eye in a bookstore.
They absolutely have.
So why are we suddenly angry that consumers care what the object looks like? Furthermore, isn't tabbing a book with sticky notes just a fun, tactile way to interact with a physical object you cherish?
It is a form of engagement.
Right. People display vinyl records on their walls because the album art looks cool, even if they mostly stream the music on their phones anyway.
That's a really good comparison.
We don't yell at them for being fake music fans. Why is there this elitist gatekeeping that says you are only a true intellectual reader if your paperback is dog-eared, stained, and you never care what it looks like?
Well, you are identifying a very powerful undercurrent here, which is the inherent elitism in how society judges different modes of consumption.
Yes.
And the sources argue that this elitism is inextricably linked to the demographic doing the consuming.
Oh, here we go.
This bridges directly into the criticism that Book Talk only promotes formulaic or trashy books, specifically focusing on the massive surge in popularity of romance and the hybrid genre known as romantasy.
Oh, this is the battlefield. This is where the online discourse gets incredibly heated.
It really does. But we cannot analyze this discourse without looking at the historical context and the deeply ingrained sociological biases at play here.
So what's the bias?
Well, formulaic, fast-paced, highly trope-driven pulp fiction has existed for over a century.
Oh, totally.
Consider the massive success of the Jack Reacher series by Lee Child, or classic Tom Clancy spy thriller, or the men's adventure pulps of the mid-20th century.
Yeah, the airport paperbacks.
Exactly. These are highly formulaic, action-driven books that are produced at a rapid pace and follow very predictable narrative arcs.
You know exactly what you're getting when you buy one.
Culturally, they're widely accepted as fun, harmless, escapist entertainment. A bad book? Or an airport read.
Nobody is writing angry think pieces about Jack Reacher ruining literature.
Exactly. Yet when young women find a highly formulaic genre they love, like romantasy, which blends fantasy world building with heavy romance tropes, and they promote it enthusiastically online, there is a sudden, intense cultural panic about the death of literature and the widespread promotion of trash.
It is the ultimate double standard. If men consume formulaic escapism, it's just a fun summer blockbuster. If women consume formulaic escapism, it is treated as a frivolous degradation of cultural standards.
The sources point out that this disproportionate hostility towards media, consumed, created, and promoted primarily by young women, is a thoroughly documented sociological phenomenon.
It happens everywhere.
Everywhere.
Huh?
Whether it is the hysteria over the Beatles' early fan base, the mockery of boy bands, or the vitriol directed at romance novels, society consistently devalues the enthusiastic interests of young women.
It's so frustrating.
We have to critically examine the architectural bias of asking why a fast-paced romance novel is deemed more trashy than a fast-paced thriller where the protagonist shoots 24 nameless henchmen.
It all circles back to the internet providing visibility, right? The platforms have given these readers a massive, highly visible megaphone to celebrate what they love.
Yes.
And that unprecedented visibility attracts an equally unprecedented level of scrutiny and pushback. And this environment of intense, hyper-scrutinized online culture doesn't just dictate how books are displayed on a shelf. It leads directly to incredibly toxic expectations placed on the authors who have no choice but to participate.
This is where the intersection of author accessibility, platform algorithms, and fandom culture becomes actively hostile to the creation of complex art.
Hostile is a strong word, but it feels accurate.
Because authors are essentially forced to be accessible online, the feedback loop between the reader and the writer is instantaneous.
Right, there's no buffering.
It is no longer mediated by a publisher's PR department or the lag time of writing a physical letter. The sources highlight a specific, highly illustrative example of this friction. Fonda Lee.
The author of the Greenbone Saga.
Yes, the critically acclaimed, multi-award-winning fantasy epic.
This is a fascinating and, frankly, disturbing case study. So Fonda Lee writes this incredibly intricate, sprawling fantasy epic. It is universally praised.
Widely beloved.
And yet she ends up taking a massive step back from social media, essentially leaving the platform after facing a barrage of incredibly toxic, bad faith interpretations of her work directly sent to her online.
Right.
What was the core of the backlash? Why were people so mad at her?
She began receiving aggressive, highly moralizing reviews and direct messages from readers complaining that her books featured an all-male cast, and they were explicitly accusing her of internalizing sexism.
Internalized sex.
The profound irony and the tragedy of this bad faith reading is that the Greenbone Saga is fundamentally a deep exploration of how women navigate, survive, and exercise power within a rigidly patriarchal mob-like society.
Right. The women are the most interesting part of those books.
Female characters like Shay and Wen are not just present, they are central, intellectually complex, and absolutely vital to the structural progression of the narrative.
They hold the whole plot together.
But because the fictional society depicted is intrinsically patriarchal, and therefore men occupy the majority of the outward violent positions of power, these readers collapse the distance between the fictional world and the author.
So they assumed that because she wrote about a patriarchal society, she must support patriarchy.
Exactly. They accuse the author herself of endorsing sexism by merely depicting it in a fictional setting.
They completely fail to separate the depiction of a flawed, oppressive society from the author's personal endorsement of that society.
And this reveals a dangerous and growing mechanism in modern reading culture: the aggressive demand that authors must rigidly stay in their lane and that their identity must serve as a perfectly pure ideological mirror.
That sounds exhausting for a writer.
In Lee's case, the underlying frustration was that certain female readers felt that because Fonda Lee is a female author, she owed her female readership an aggressive, utopian overrepresentation of female characters.
Like she had a quota to fill.
If she did not provide a perfectly balanced demographic spreadsheet of characters, she was deemed to be failing her gender.
And she pointed out in her public response how deeply structurally unfair that burden is. There is a massive, quiet double standard operating here. When a male author writes a sweeping epic from a male perspective, the culture treats it as universal.
It's just the default.
Everyone, regardless of gender, is expected to read it, relate to the human struggle within it, and recognize its artistic merit. But the moment a female author writes a sweeping epic, or writes primarily from a female perspective, it is instantly categorized as neat or women.
Right.
She faces this toxic pressure to act as a flawless political representative for her gender in every single line of dialogue. A standard male authors are almost never.
It is the suffocating burden of representation, and it stems from a fundamental erosion of literary patience.
What do you mean by literary patience?
Modern internet discourse encourages instant moral categorization. If a fictional character expresses a sexist, racist, or otherwise problematic thought in Chapter 3, a certain subset of modern readers will immediately drop the book.
Right. They put it down, they log on to social media, and they declare the author themselves.
Exactly. And this completely denies the story the architectural space required for character growth, for narrative consequences, or for the subtle societal critique that the author might be carefully building toward a payoff in Chapter 30.
They demand that the moral purity of the story and the author be definitively established on page 1. But that is the antithesis of how compelling storytelling works.
It kills the narrative engine.
If characters start out perfect, there is no arc. The story is dead on arrival.
This hypervigilance online often ignores the quality of the narrative in favor of a superficial moral checklist. And this brings us to an even thornier, much deeper philosophical issue discussed extensively in the sources.
Okay, let's get into
the modern crisis surrounding the death of the author. What happens when you conceptually understand that you should separate the art from the artist, but the architecture of the internet simply won't allow you to do so?
To understand how wild this shift is, we really need to look at what that phrase originally meant, because people miss all the time.
They absolutely do.
Death of the author was not about cancel. It originated in 1967 with an essay by the French literary critic Roland Barthes.
Yes.
He argued that the author's personal biography, their intentions, and their political views shouldn't matter once the text is published. He famously said that a text is a tissue of quotations, meaning it's just a combination of cultural ideas.
Right.
Therefore, the only thing that matters is the reader's interpretation. The author is figuratively dead the moment the book is in your hand. But today, the internet has taken that academic concept and literalized it into a daily moral crisis.
It's no longer a question of interpretation. It is a question of ethical consumption.
Exactly. The internet asks, can we and should we consume art made by bad people?
The sources bring up the incredibly complex case of Cixin Liu. He is the author of the massive, globally renowned science fiction series Remembrance of Earth's Path, commonly known as the three-body problem.
Oh, yes, a masterpiece of modern sci-fi.
It is a staggering work of speculative fiction that grapples with physics, sociology, and the survival of the human race. However, in interviews, Liu has expressed personal and political views regarding the Chinese government's policies that many readers in the West find deeply controversial and morally reprehensible.
Right. And as a modern reader, heavily embedded in online discourse, you find yourself trapped in this terrible dilemma. You read the book, they are brilliant. They completely expand your mind. They challenge your understanding of the universe, profound insights in human nature. And then you log on to Twitter or Reddit, and you find out the creator holds views that completely violate your personal.
It creates a profound, almost physical sensation of cognitive dissonance. The brain struggles to reconcile the profound beauty of the creation with the perceived ugliness of the creator.
It is the ultimate modern metaphor. It is like going to a highly recommended restaurant, having the most transcendent, life-changing, beautiful meal of
Right.
and then walking to your car and reading an article revealing that the head chef is just a terrible, abusive human being.
Yes, that's exactly the feeling.
And the immediate pressure from the digital ecosystem is that you must now retroactively disavow the meal. You must pretend it didn't taste.
You have to reject the experience entirely.
Do I have to meticulously research the background, the voting record, and the social media history of every single creator, every author, every sound engineer, every film producer, every session musician before I am allowed to consume and enjoy their art? It is an absolutely exhausting, paralyzing.
The sources argue that it is an unsustainable burden to place on the consumer. If we applied a standard of absolute moral purity to the consumption of art, we would be left with almost nothing.
Nothing at all.
The sources mention Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings cinematic trilogy.
Oh, this is a great example.
These films are universally beloved. They are sweeping cultural touchstones that have brought joy to hundreds of millions of people. Yet Harvey Weinstein, a man convicted of horrific crimes, was an early producer on those films.
That's right. He was involved at Miramax before New Line Cinema took over.
He was instrumental in getting the project off the ground in its early stage. So are we, as a culture, demanding that everyone boycott and disavow the entire Peter Jackson trilogy?
No. The cultural consensus is definitely no.
Right. Because the sheer scale and collaborative nature of the art has transcended that specific toxic association.
It's too big and too beautiful to let one terrible person ruin it for the entire world.
Precisely. The consensus forming within the critical essays we are examining is that, yes, fundamentally flawed, deeply problematic people can and do make magnificent, culturally vital art.
That's just a historical fact.
The ability to structure a compelling narrative or compose a beautiful symphony is not intrinsically tied to an individual's moral compass. While consumers should absolutely be mindful of where their financial support goes and can choose to boycott active harm, the demand for absolute retroactive moral alignment from every creator before engaging with a piece of media is reductive.
It flattens everything.
It flattens the complexity of human creation into a binary purity test.
So the internet has created this incredibly fraught, highly scrutinized dynamic regarding the moral purity of the author. But let's look at how the internet has completely rewired our relationship with the actual text itself.
Okay.
Because the need for control that drives the purity testing also drives another massive, distinctly modern obsession, absolute terror of spoilers.
This is one of the most fascinating cultural shifts detailed in the source because it upends how we assume humanity has always interacted with stories.
Amen.
Our intense, often aggressive culture surrounding spoilers. The idea that knowing the ending fundamentally destroys the value of the experience is almost entirely a post-internet, post-streaming invention.
Really? Because it feels so innate. It feels like people must have always freaked out about knowing the twist ending of a mystery.
There was certainly a desire for surprise, but not to the neurotic degree we see today. We have to look at the historical architecture of media consumption. In the past, consumption was largely synchronized.
Everyone watched at the same time.
Exactly. You went to a movie theater during a specific theatrical run. You watched a television show at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night, because that was the only time it was broadcast.
Right.
You discussed it the next day around the water cooler with your immediate, localized social circle. The concept of a spoiler existed in its infancy. I mean, Alfred Hitchcock famously instituted a policy barring latecomers from entering the theater for Psycho in 1960 to preserve the twist.
Right, but that was a huge marketing gimmick.
It was, but the actual word spoiler in our modern context didn't really enter the vernacular until the early 1970s, and spoiler warnings didn't become a standardized cultural practice until the 1980s.
And what changed in the 1980s? The dawn of early internet discussion boards like Usenet.
Precisely.
Because suddenly, for the first time in human history, you were casually discussing media with strangers located all over the world in different time zones who might not have had access to the broadcast yet.
Exact. The synchronization of consumption began to fracture. And then the true shattering of synchronized consumption arrived with DVR technology like TiVo, and ultimately streaming services like Netflix and Hulu in the late 2000s.
Because now everyone is on their own timeline.
Suddenly, everyone is watching everything at their own entirely unique pace. Binge watching became, because the shared cultural timeline was destroyed, the hypervigilance around preserving the surprise had to be exponentially increased.
That makes total historical sense.
But before this digital fragmentation, the culture was remarkably looser. The sources point to a truly mind-boggling historical artifact.
Oh, I love this one.
A 1976 profile of a young director named George Lucas, published in the New York Times. This profile was published a full year before Star Wars. A New Hope was released in theater. In this profile, Lucas casually walks the reporter through the entire plot of the movie.
He just tells them everything.
He explains the concept of the Force. He details the climax. He explicitly tells the reporter that the rebels blow up the Death Star. He gave away the ending to the biggest movie in cinematic history, a year early, in the newspaper of record.
That is inconceivable today. If a director gave away the ending of a massive franchise movie a year early, the studio's legal team would physically tackle them during the interview.
They absolutely would.
But here is where the sources take this historical anomaly and apply hard science to it, and they claim that everything we culturally believe about spoilers ruining a story is actually scientifically measurably.
This is the turning point in the research. A highly cited study conducted at the University of California, San Diego by psychology researchers Jonathan Levitt and Nicholas Christenfeld set out to empirically test the spoiler ruins the story hypothesis.
How do they test it?
They structured an incredibly thorough experiment. They took dozens of short stories across various genres. They used ironic twist stories by authors like Roald Dahl, classic mysteries by Agatha Christie, and evocative literary fiction by Raymond Carver. They divided participants into three. Group 1 read the stories completely
So a normal reading
Group 2 read the stories, but the twist ending was accidentally revealed in an introductory paragraph.
Got it.
And Group 3 read the stories where the spoiler was explicitly integrated directly into the opening text of the narrative itself. After reading, participants rated the stories on a scale of overall enjoyment and aesthetic appreciation.
And what happened?
The results were statistically significant and completely counterintuitive. Participants actually enjoyed the stories more when they were spoiled.
More. I am struggling to process that. How is that functionally possible?
Across almost all genres, knowing the ending increased the reader's pleasure.
But if the entire plot of an Agatha Christie novel is finding out who the murderer, what is the point of reading it if you already know it was the butler?
The researchers attribute this phenomenon to a well-documented cognitive mechanism called perceptual fluency.
Perceptual fluency. Okay, explain that.
When you are reading a complex narrative, your brain is burning a significant amount of cognitive energy trying to solve the puzzle. You are tracking clues, anticipating what happens next, and trying to stay ahead of the author.
Right, you're doing mental work.
But when you already know the outcome of the story, you are no longer expending that energy on anticipation. You are processing the narrative with a profound sense of ease.
Oh, because the pressure is...
This ease of processing, this perceptual fluency, frees up your cognitive bandwidth. It allows you to focus deeply on the aesthetic architecture of the text. You suddenly notice the elegance of the prose. You appreciate the subtle foreshadowing that the author wove into chapter 1.
You can see the scaffolding.
You focus on the nuanced emotional development of the characters rather than just rushing to see if they survive. You elevate your interaction from simply wanting to know what happens to deeply appreciating how the story is told.
Okay, I have to confess, I'm fiercely spoiler phobic.
A lot of people are.
Like, I will aggressively mute words on social media. I refuse to watch theatrical trailers because they give away too much of the third act. I purposely hid the famous "I am your father" twist in The Empire Strikes Back.
Did you really?
I meticulously curated their media, covering their eyes and ears if it was ref pop culture, just so they could sit on the couch and have that pure, visceral moment of shock.
And did they?
They did, and it was great. But hearing this research on perceptual fluency, it makes me question my own motives. Am I just trying to selfishly clone my own childhood nostalgia through Am I prioritizing a 5-second hit of surprise over giving them the cognitive space to actually appreciate the storytelling arc?
It is a very common, very human realization. We attach immense emotional weight to our own first unspoiled experience of a narrative, and we desperately want to pass that specific emotional high on to others.
We want to chase that high.
But the UC San Diego study does include important nuance. It is not a blanket rule for every single piece of media. The researchers noted that spoilers do generally decrease enjoyment in one specific genre.
Which is?
Comedy.
Well, logically, if you know the punchline before the setup, the joke is dead.
Exactly. Comedy relies entirely on the subversion of expectation, operating on a very specific rhythmic timing. Once the subversion is known, the physiological response laughter cannot be triggered in the same way.
That makes perfect sense.
Conversely, the sources point out that spoilers often massively enhance the enjoyment of horror.
Oh, interesting. Why horror?
In horror, the overwhelming anxiety of the unknown is the entire. But for many viewers, that anxiety is too intense to allow for actual enjoyment. Knowing when the jump scare happens or knowing which characters survive the ordeal reduces that anxiety to a managed safe level.
Oh, so it lets them actually watch the movie?
It gives the viewer a sense of control, allowing them to actually enjoy the creepy atmosphere, the cinematography, and the tension, rather than just suffering through a state of panic.
That makes total sense. I know people who physically cannot read a thriller without fear. They need to verify that their favorite character, and once they have that, they can relax.
It's a coping mechanism.
And the sources also point out how this philosophical divide over spoilers plays out in real within different literary fandom. Let's look at the fandom for Brandon Sanderson versus the fandom for the late Terry Pratchett's disc.
Night and day difference.
Sanderson writes massive, intricate, mathematically precise magic systems and interconnected plot. His fandom guards spoilers with a ferocity that is almost frightening.
Very protective.
Why? Because the intellectual revelation of how the magic work and how the various plot threads finally connect in the final pages is a massive part of the value prop in his work. The puzzle is the point. But the Discworld fandom, they generally couldn't care less about spoilers because the value of a Terry Pratchett book isn't rooted in a shocking twist ending. The value is in the brilliant, deeply empathetic, satirical prose on every single page. Knowing the plot of Guards doesn't diminish the absolute joy of reading Pratchett's sentences.
And that contrast leads us to a profound structural realization about storytelling itself.
What's that?
If knowing the ending doesn't intrinsically ruin a story, then what does ruin a story?
Bad writer.
When we look at massive franchise adaptations and industry copycats, their failure rarely comes from the audience knowing the plot in advance. The failure comes from creators fundamentally misunderstanding the structural architecture of what made the original story work in the first place.
They learn the wrong lessons from success.
Exactly. This is perhaps the most critical part of our deep dive. Hollywood studios and massive publishing houses are risk-averse. They constantly try to replicate massive, proven hits.
Because it feels like guaranteed money.
But they tend to strip the shiny, superficial elements out of the original work and completely ignore the load-bearing context that held it up. And we see this structurally with the publishing industry's absolute obsession with the trilogy format.
Oh, the trilogy. Why does every single fantasy or sci-fi series have to be exactly 3 books? So often leads to a structural failure that the sources call middle syndrome.
Well, the prevalence of the trilogy is not accidental. It is deeply rooted in both human cognitive psychology and classical structural tradition.
Explain the psychology part.
Humans have a profound psychological preference for the rule of 3. We see it everywhere in our cultural architect. The 3 little pigs, ready, aim, fire, past, present, future, the Holy Trinity.
We just like things in 3.
The human brain perceives a group of 3 as a complete, satisfying cycle. In storytelling, this perfectly mirrors the classical 3-act structure that has dominated Western narrative since Aristotle.
Act 1 is the setup. Act 2 is the conflict, and Act 3 is the resolution.
Exactly. Think of it as a load-bearing architectural art. You have the 2 foundational pillars of setup and resolution, and the conflict acts as the keystone holding the tension together.
But the structural failure happens when an author pitches a story that organically only has enough plot to fill 2 books.
Right.
The publisher, looking at market trends and wanting to maximize a single intellectual property, forces the author to stretch that tight duology brawling trilogy.
That artificial stretching is the exact root cause of middle book syndrome. The narrative architecture collapses.
How does it collapse?
The first book retains all the exciting world-building, character introductions, and inciting incident. The third book gets all the explosive climaxes, the major battles, and the emotional resolution.
And book 2 gets
what? The second book is left functionally hollow. It is forced to just tread water, moving pieces around the board without actually advancing the core narrative, simply to delay the climax until book 3.
Just killing time.
The sources analyze this using a few prominent examples. They look at Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn Era 1 trilogy.
Okay, a huge series.
While highly acclaimed, many readers and critics feel the second book, The Well of Ascension, drags significantly.
Why?
The plot revolves around a protracted political siege of a city, which is necessary for setting up the geopolitical stakes of the third book, but functionally, the core characters spend hundreds of pages trapped in a holding pattern. The book struggles to stand alone as a satisfying narrative.
And what's another example?
The sources also point to V.E. Schwab's A Darker Shade of Magic series. The critical argument is that the second book feels largely unnecessary to the overarching plot, focusing on a magical tournament rather than the core conflict, and that the story would have been far stronger and tighter if it had simply been a duology.
It is narrative padding, but when the trilogy structure is utilized correctly, when the story organically demands that scale, it is magnificent.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources cite Robin Hobb's Farseer trilogy as the absolute gold standard for this arc.
A masterpiece of pacing.
Because Robin Hobb ensures that each book individually follows a perfect, satisfying three-act structure of setup, conflict, and resolution. And then the series as a whole, mimics that exact same structure. It is structurally flawless. There is no padding. Every chapter bears.
Beautifully constructed.
But beyond just structural pacing, let's look at the thematic failure. Let's look at the wrong lessons creators take from massive cultural phenomena. We have to start with the tidal wave that was the Hungers.
Oh, that changed everything.
When that book hit, it changed the industry. What did the copycats get so fundamentally wrong?
Well, following the stratospheric success of Suzanne Collins' The Hunger Games, the publishing industry flooded the market with dystopian stories featuring what they believed was the winning formula: emotionally reserved, physically aggressive, badass girls fighting the government.
Right. They just wrote characters who constantly declared, "I am not like other girls," handed them a bow and arrow, and expected millions of dollars.
Exactly. But almost universally, these copycats failed to capture the cultural zeitgeist or achieve lasting relevance. Why? Because the copycats extracted the superficial character archetype and completely discarded the deep sociological context that made Katniss Everdeen compelling.
They missed the entire point of her character.
They missed the psychological core of the work. Katniss Everdeen's rejection of traditional femininity and her extreme emotional guardedness are not just cool personality quirks designed to make her look tough.
No, they're trauma responses.
They are a direct, visceral trauma response to the oppressive, hyper-artificial, performative nature of the cap. Her personality is a logical survival mechanism within her specific world.
And even more critically, the copycats entirely missed the architectural genius of her dynamic with the male lead, Peeta Mellark.
Peeta is so important.
In a medium young adult fiction that is historically saturated with brooding, aggressive, physically dominant male love interests, Peeta is a math. He is sensitive, he's emotionally in tune, he is an artist, and he is physically less capable in combat than Katniss. He serves as an emotional anchor, he grounds her trauma.
Exactly.
If a writer just copies the aggressive female lead, but surrounds her with equally aggressive male characters, contrast is lost, the emotional grounding is gone, and the protagonist just feels flat and antagonistic.
It is surface-level mimicry of iconography, completely missing the thematic foundation. And we saw this exact same phenomenon play out in television with Game of Thrones.
Oh, yes. The grim, dark era.
The show becomes a global sensation, the biggest water cooler show of a generation. So the industry takeaway was incredibly reductive. Audiences want fantasy with graphic violence, shocking main character deaths, and explicit sex.
So we get a wave of what is termed grimdark fantasy shows and books desperately trying to outshock each other with cruelty. Why does George R.R. Martin's violence, while the copycats just feel exploited?
Because Martin does not deploy shock value for the sake of shock value. The foundational architecture of his world is political concept. Take the most famous shock of the series, the Red Wedding.
Iconic. Devastating.
When that episode aired, it was culturally devastating. People filmed their friends reacting to it, but it wasn't devastating merely because it was gory. It was devastating because it was deeply, deeply rooted in complex character flaw, and it was heavily logically foreshadowed.
The characters dug their own.
Robb Stark, the heroic king, makes a series of politically disastrous choices rooted in his own youth and rigid sense of honor. He breaks a crucial marriage pact.
Right. With the Frey.
The consequence of that political blunder in a ruthless medieval society is assassination. The characters made choices that align perfectly with their established psychology, and the brutal consequences were the logical, inevitable outcome within the rules of that specific world.
It made sense within the world.
If a copycat writer just drops a sudden bloodbath into a story without doing the grueling, chapters-long work of establishing the political and psychological inevitability of that violence, the audience doesn't feel moved. They feel cheaply manipulated.
And we see this misstep in massive franchise extensions as well, where billions of dollars are on the line. Look at the Rings of Power on Amazon, the prequel to The Lord of the Rings.
It's a very relevant example.
The showrunners dedicated a massive subplot to the Harfoots, the nomadic ancestors of the Hobbit. But critically, their inclusion felt entirely disjointed and tonally off huge portion audience.
The lesson the creators seemingly extracted from the success of Peter Jackson's movies was simply, audiences love Hobbit. Hobbits are cute and nostalgic. Therefore, a successful Middle-earth show must include a Hobbit-like species.
Just dropping them in for brand recognition.
But they ignored the deep thematic architecture of why Tolkien used Hobbit.
Right. Tolkien didn't put hobbits in his story just to be cute. They serve a highly specific, load-bearing thematic purpose. They are the smallest, least powerful, most overlooked people in a world populated by immortal elven kings, ancient wizards, and dark gods. And yet, Tolkien's entire thesis is that these insignificant people are the ones who ultimately save the world, not through martial prowess, but through resilience, friendship, and quiet courage.
That's the core of the work.
If you just throw early hobbits into a prequel purely for brand recognition and nostalgia, without integrating them into a thematic argument about power and insignificance, they just become very expensive window dressing.
Exactly. When creators rely on surface-level tropes, cheap shocks, or unearned nostalgia, the narratives eventually collapse under their own hollow weight.
They don't last.
But when creators do not strip away the theme, when they lean heavily into the deep, underlying emotional architecture of a narrative, speculative media achieves its highest, most profound purpose. And that purpose, as highlighted by our sources, is helping the reader heal.
This is where we shift from the mechanics and business of storytelling to the actual soul. The sources make a deeply compelling, psychologically backed argument that fantasy and science fiction are uniquely positioned, perhaps more so than purely realistic fiction, to help readers process massive, overwhelming experience, grief, trauma, and depression.
It's a powerful argument.
How does reading about dragons or spaceships help someone process real-world trauma? By taking those incredibly abstract internal concepts and making them physical, external, and tangible.
The mechanism operating here is deeply rooted in clinical psychology. The sources draw a direct line between reading speculative fiction and the psychological practice of play therapy.
Play therapy, like with kids.
Yes, child psychologists frequently utilize play therapy to help children process overwhelming, complex emotions or traumatic events. A child often lacks the vocabulary to articulate complex grief.
Right, they can't just explain how they're feeling.
But in play therapy, the child can act out traumatic or confusing scenarios using dolls, toys, or role. They are placed in a completely safe, unreal environment.
That gives them
Because it is play, they have a degree of separation from the raw emotion, and most importantly, they can exert control over the narrative outcome. Reading speculative fiction is fundamentally the adult cognitive extension of play therapy.
That is profound.
It provides a safe, completely unreal space, a necessary degree of separation achieved through metaphor to explore deeply real, terrifying, and difficult human emotion.
Because sometimes reading a purely realistic contemporary fiction book about a character spiraling into severe depression is just too depressing.
It's too raw.
It is too close to home. The reflection in the mirror is too sharp. But when you wrap that exact same emotional journey in magic, the dynamic completely... Look at the absolute cultural dominance of Harry Potter.
A perfect example.
J.K. Rowling didn't just write a gritty, realistic novel about a teenager suffering from clinical depression and PTSD. She created the Dementors. They are literal physical manifestations of the concept. They're described as draining all hope and warmth from the air, forcing you to relive your absolute worst memories and leaving you feeling like never be cheerful again.
That is a clinical description of a depressive episode.
And the brilliant part is the cure, the Patronus charm. You cannot defeat a Dementor with a sword. You have to focus all your energy on a single, powerful, genuinely happy memory to manifest a shield of light that banishes the monster. That specific imagery resonated with millions of people because it gave them a physical, actionable metaphor for fighting an invisible internal illness.
It takes the indescribable and makes it manageable. The sources explore several other brilliant executions of this concept. Look at the late Terry Pratchett's Discworld series.
Oh, I love Pratchett's death.
Pratchett takes the ultimate terrifying abstract concept, death, and turns him into a literal recurring character. Death speaks in hollow, all-caps text. He rides a pale horse, and he is utilized for immense comedic effect.
He's hilarious.
But beyond the brilliant satire, Pratchett's version of death is profoundly, deeply empathetic. By personifying death, by making him a character who tries to understand humanity, who adopts a cat, who can be conversed with and reasoned with, Pratchett allows the reader to examine the terrifying reality of mortality with levity and deep philosophical.
In books like Reaper Man, death isn't a monster. He is a necessary, compassionate force.
It is a masterclass in using fantasy to defang existential dread.
Or take science fiction, which does the exact same thing but with physics instead of magic. Look at Ted Chiang's brilliant short story, Story of Your Life, which was later adapted into the stunning Denis Villeneuve film Arrival.
Oh, that movie break.
It uses the hard sci-fi concept of linguistics and non-linear time to explore the absolute devastation. The protagonist learns an alien language that fundamentally alters her brain, allowing her to experience time She sees her entire life, including the birth and the tragic premature death.
It forces the reader into a staggering philosophical corner regarding the cost of love and loss.
If you know exactly how tragically something will end, if you know the exact depth of the pain that is coming, it is a breathtaking, devastating mother, achieved entirely through a speculative lens that would possibly.
And perhaps the most resonant modern example brought up in our analysis sources is Brandon Sanderson's massive epic fan Stormlight.
Yes, the magic system in that's incredible.
The series is famous for its intricate world building, but its true structural core is its handling of mental health. The series follows a cast of characters who are deeply, realistically broken by severe trauma, addiction, imposter syndrome, and clinical depression.
They are all struggling.
In Sanderson's world, the magic system itself is intrinsically, mechanically tied to that psychological broken. There are magical, sentient entities called spren. These spren are only attracted to and can only bond with humans who have what the author termed gaps in their spirit web, literal cracks in their soul left by intense trauma. The spren fill these gaps, and that bond is what grants the character magical ability.
The author has actually explicitly compared this magic system to the concept of kintsugi. For those who aren't familiar, kintsugi is the traditional Japanese art of taking broken pottery and fixing the cracks using lacquer mixed with powdered gold.
It's a beautiful philosophy.
The philosophy behind kintsugi is that the mended pottery is considered more beautiful, stronger, and more valuable because of its broken history, not inspired. The break is a feature, not a bug to be hit. The magic in the Stormlight archive acts as emotional. We see a character like Kaladin who struggles relentlessly with severe, debilitating seasonal affective depression survivor. The magical bond he forms doesn't miraculously cure his depression. He still has dark days where he cannot get out of bed. But the magic validates his struggle. It tells the reader that his brokenness is exactly what makes him worthy of power. It gives him the tools to keep fighting.
It is using the fantastic to validate the reality of psychology. The sources also highlight a similar, incredibly powerful moment in Robert Jordan's foundational Wheel of Time series.
Oh, the cleansing scene.
There is a scene where a healer character, Nynaeve, attempts to magically probe and heal the protagonist, Rand Althor. Instead of finding a physical wound, she discovers a massive, dark, thorny physical manifestation of his immense, accumulated emotional trauma and madness.
She can actually see his pain.
The magic allows the invisible weight of his psychological burden to be seen, quantified, and validated by another character.
Okay, looking at all these deeply resonant stories, looking at how they provide this essential, almost clinical function of processing trauma and teaching us resilience, I have to ask the natural question.
What's the question?
When are we getting the next? It feels like it has been a very long time since the entire global culture was fundamentally obsessed with the exact same fictional universe. We have fragmented so much.
To predict the emergence of the next global phenomenon, the sources attempt to reverse engineer the DNA of the past ones.
Like finding the formula.
They identify the three undisputed biggest cultural phenomenons in modern speculative fiction as Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, George Lucas's Star Wars, and J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter. While vastly different in tone and setting, these three properties share a highly specific, load-bearing structural DNA.
Okay, break down the DNA. What's the first element?
First, they possess genuine cultural permanence, evidenced by a shared cultural vernacular. Even if a person has never seen a single frame of a Star Wars film, they know what a Jedi is. They know what a lightsaber sounds like. They know the phrase, "May the Force be with you."
Yeah, it's just in the air we breathe.
If you have never read a single page of Harry Potter, you still know the difference between a Gryffindor and a Slytherin.
Exactly. I see the Tolkien quote, "Not all those who wander are lost," tattooed on people, or printed on the bumper stickers of minivans, driven by people who have definitely never attempted to read the Silmarillion. The iconography has fully permeated the baseline culture.
Second, all three rigidly follow the classical Campbellian hero's journey framework.
The classic myth structure.
They feature a reluctant, often orphaned hero drawn from obscurity. They feature a clear call to adventure. Crucially, they feature the archetype of the wise, sacrificing mentor Gandalf, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Albus Dumbledore.
Check, check, and check.
Third, they present a highly legible, classic, good versus evil overarching conflict, but they complicate that binary with powerful, emotionally devastating arcs of redemption. Think of the emotional weight of Darth Vader's final moment, or the complex, tragic revelation of Severus Snape's true loyalty.
And crucially, and I think this might actually be the single most important load-bearing pillar of the DNA, they are all inherently family-friendly at their core.
Ah, yes, the multi-generational aspect.
They are accessible to children but complex enough for adults, which creates a massive multi-generational nostalgia. You read Harry Potter when you were 10 years old and now you are 35, and you are reading it aloud to your own 10-year-old before. You watch Star Wars on VHS with your dad, and now you are taking your daughter to the movie theater to see the new one. The fandom organically, biologically reads itself.
Which forces us to critically evaluate the dominant cultural force of the last decade, Game of Thrones. Why, despite its absolute domination of the cultural conversation for 8 years, did it fail to achieve the same lasting, multi-generational permanence as Lord of the Rings?
I mean, the family-friendly pillar is completely missing. You definitely cannot sit down and watch The Red Wedding or the rampant sexual violence with your 8-year-old child. It completely lacks that multi-generational nostalgia loop. And secondly, the showrunners completely fumbled the structural. The final season was so rushed, so structurally unsound, and left such a bitter taste in the cultural mouth that it killed the rewatchability. People don't revisit it the way they rewatch Jackson. And what about the superhero boo? The Marvel Cinematic Universe dominated the global box office for over a decade. Doesn't that count as the next phenomenon?
The sources argue that while superheroes certainly possess the cultural vernacular, the narrative architecture is fundamentally too fragmented to serve the same unifying purpose.
Too many pieces.
There are dozens of competing timelines, constant corporate reboots, alternate universes, and a sprawling cast of characters with no central protagonist. It lacks the singular, unifying, mythic narrative spine of a Frodo carrying a single ring to Mount Doom.
So what's the prediction?
Therefore, based on the synthesis of this cultural DNA, the sources predict that the next true, unifying global phenomenon will not be a grimdark fantasy or a fragmented cinematic universe. It is highly likely to be a middle grade or young adult book series. It will be a classical hero's journey filled with earnest hope, clear redemption arcs, and a legible moral framework that simply hasn't been adapted into visual media.
So it is probably been an absolute start class of author exhaust.
We also entirely dismantled the cultural myth of the spoil, learning the cognitive science behind why knowing the end of a story might actually help us appreciate the structural beauty of the journey more, thanks to the mechanics of perceptual fluence. And ultimately, we saw how, despite all the commercialization, the algorithmic strip mining of our attention, and the relentless noise of the internet, the core architectural function of speculative fiction remains miraculously intact, providing us with the magical, metaphorical tools to process our very real, deeply human grief and trauma.
And as you go about your day, I want to remind you that how you interact with all this media and how you allocate your cognitive bandwidth is entirely in your. Whether you find yourself doom scrolling through a highly optimized algorithm, whether you are carefully color coordinating your sticky notes to match the aesthetic of your favorite fantasy novel, or whether you are happily rereading a dog-eared book where you already know every single twist and turn by heart, your attention is the most valuable commodity you own. It is yours to spend it on the stories that heal you.
And as we consider the uncertain future of how these stories are created and discovered, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought. We spent the last hour discussing how the next massive global phenomenon, the story that will define the next generation the way Harry Potter or the Lord of the Rings defined ours, has likely already been written and is simply waiting to be found.
Right.
But consider the structural reality of the industry we unpacked at the beginning of this deep dive. If the modern publishing landscape now aggressively, systematically filters for authors who already possess a massive, pre-built TikTok following and demands a 25-page digital marketing business plan before an editor even glances at the manuscript, might we entirely miss the next Tolkien? Might we completely overlook the next monumental generation-defining voice simply because they were a quiet, introverted genius who absolutely refused to post a dancing video on the internet?
Oof, that is a heavy, structurally terrifying thought to end on. But that is exactly why we do. Keep reading The Quiet Voice, keep questioning the architecture of everything you consume, and keep diving deep. We will see you next